Hey all, your OS reviews. Today we're taking a quick look at the TCL 10 5G UW. This is an interesting phone for a couple of reasons. To start, TCL is not a brand that we usually associate with making smartphones. They are more well known for their TVs. That being said, they've actually been manufacturing phones under the Alcatel brand for a number of years now, but it's only until recently that they've started to use their own brand on their own devices. In addition, they've manufactured many of the Android-powered BlackBerry phones. This phone is not the newest on the market anymore, and as a result, it is often found at a pretty steep discount. For example, street price on sites like Amazon and eBay can sometimes hover around $50 or so, making it extremely low cost, another ultra budget smartphone to consider, perhaps as a backup device, giving it to a child, or even using it as a media player. And the specs are not bad as a mid-range Android smartphone, even here in late 2023, heading into 2024. Namely, it's rocking the Qualcomm Snapdragon 765G 5G processor, which is octa-core 7nm, and it's actually the same chip found on the Google Pixel 5, as well as the Nokia 8.3 5G. That being said, the TCL 10 5G here is actually a little bit more compact, and it actually comes in two variants. There is a international unlocked model, which doesn't have the UW at the end. It's rocking the exact same processor and specs, by the way, but the UW version that we have here is just exclusive for Verizon. It has a slightly different texture on the back plate, but again, specs as well as dimensions are still exactly the same. Speaking of, this model shimmers when you're pointing at the light. It's kind of a crazy gradient effect going on. I kind of like the look, just sets it apart from the crowd. There's also a vertical camera bar on the rear here, which consists of a primary 48 megapixel lens along with a ultra wide angle 8 megapixel camera, a 5 megapixel macro lens flanked by dual LED flashes on the left and the right side of the bar, kind of a unusual placement. And then down below here is a pretty traditional fingerprint scanner. Now, interestingly, TCL claims that the build quality here is quite premium, made out of glass on the front, on the back, as well as aluminum sides. That being said, when I'm actually holding this phone in my hand, it interestingly feels a little bit closer to plastic on the side as well as the back. Not that I'm complaining, because it doesn't feel cheap, but it just isn't quite as cold as traditional glass and aluminum. So this could be very well a similar case as what Google as well as LG did on the Pixel 5 and the LG G5 a couple of years prior, where even though this is a aluminum metal phone, they coated it in a layer of plastic to make it feel a little bit more grippy, but as a result, it kind of feels like a plastic phone. Regardless, the phone comes coupled with 6GB of built-in RAM, 128GB of built-in storage, further expandable via micro SD card slot, as well as a 4,500 milliamp hour capacity battery that can top up at 18 watts using the Type-C port on the bottom there, but like most mid-end phones, there is no Qi wireless charging. Overall, it's a pretty sizable cell, and it can last mostly through a day and a half, if not 2 days, before you have to really recharge it again, so pretty decent battery performance. Located on the right-hand spine is going to be the volume rocker as well as the power key, and located on the very top is the 3.5mm headphone jack, another rarity in this day and age, although this particular model doesn't come with an infrared blaster for controlling TV appliances. Unlike the TCL 10 Pro, it has a curved OLED display as compared to an IPS LCD screen on the 10 5G over here. That being said, again, the processor here being the Snapdragon 700 series is ironically a little bit more powerful than the Snapdragon 675 found on the 10 Pro. It also comes with some interesting display software tricks, including an upscaling from SDR to HDR automatically, and there's also a reading mode, which is quite similar to the software tricks found on the TCL 10 Next paper that has been making some waves lately as a quote-unquote eReader smartphone. However, this isn't really the same thing as a eink display. In fact, it's still an IPS LCD, just like the TCL 10 5G over here. The only difference is that this phone has a frosted glass finish on the front, which is kind of similar to a matte screen protector, to be completely honest. So it's something that you can actually simulate on the much cheaper and slightly older 10 5G instead, if you just apply a screen protector and then activate the reading mode in the software settings. But TCL does tout eink-like colors, which are a little bit more comfortable on your eyes as you're reading back text. A closer look at the front, we do have a hole punch cutout in the left-hand corner to accommodate the 16 megapixel selfie lens, as well as a proximity light sensor. Overall, though, it still offers a pretty good screen-to-body ratio, which is a slightly larger chin at the bottom since it is a LCD screen, which, by the way, is Full HD 1080p resolution. Still looks quite sharp and good as a LCD panel overall. Now, one neat kind of trick on the unlock widget here is if you plug it in for charging, the clock widget here will actually show a battery icon as it's starting to get filled up, and it will reach all the way to the top when the battery reaches 100%. So some small touches there from TCL that just makes it feel a little bit more polished. Otherwise, fingerprint scanner is quite fast, and thankfully TCL's skin on top of Android is rather clean and uncluttered. We really have just the standard Google apps as well as the Play Store pre-installed, and that is mostly it. And the Snapdragon 765G is still a very capable mid-range chipset even here heading into 2024, where navigating around the UI and day-to-day interactions still feel fluid enough despite this not being a faster 90 or 120 Hz refresh rate screen. So it's going to be more standard there at 60. Otherwise, we can pull down the notification shade here to take a look at some of the extras, including built-in NFC for contactless mobile payment. There is Bluetooth 5.0, GPS, but perhaps more importantly, on the second screen here is where we can activate the aforementioned reading mode, which if we jump into immediately and flick it on, you can see how colors become a lot more muted. But the texture here is, again, quite similar to something like a Kindle eReader if it was in color. And one benefit here is, of course, you have faster refresh rates compared to True Ink, where it commonly flashes or refreshes every time a page is being turned as a limitation of that technology. Whereas on here, everything is still smooth. Articles and ebooks just feel a little bit more comfortable using the panel and the mode here on this phone. So this is going to be actually a pretty strong choice if you're doing a lot of reading, seeming super close to a color e-ink display in this mode. Actually quite clever from a software perspective. Plus you can always use, again, something like a matte screen protector on top if you want even more of that paper-like feel. Similarly, under the NXTVISION section of advanced settings, you can turn on the aforementioned SDR-to-HDR conversion for more contrast, and also turn on the color temperature adjustment settings for making it more warm versus cold, as well as adaptive tone that will change itself dynamically according to the ambient light, very similar to on some Google Home products. So display optimization is definitely one of the more advanced aspects of the TCL software experience, it seems, that kind of sets it apart from the crowd. And aside from this, the only other aspect that TCL has tampered with would include some additional lock screens as well as themes that you're able to apply on the phone that just slightly changes the way the icons look. And all of the included wallpapers on the phone as well do take advantage of the rather contrast-rich nature of this IPS LCD panel and do all look quite good. The only other customization in terms of app that TCL has built on in would be the clock that they have slightly tweaked compared to stock Android, giving it just a slightly different look overall. That being said, one area that TCL as a smaller phone manufacturer at the end of the day still isn't going to be able to beat Samsung and also Google themselves in would be longer-term software support. For example, TCL shipped the phone with Android 10.0, but software updates have been very scarce aside from security patches here and there, unlike Samsung and Google that provides years and years of OS level updates over the air. Now jumping into a demo of the camera performance next, it's typically an area where smaller phone manufacturers tend to struggle a bit more in terms of software processing, and unfortunately TCL really isn't an exception to this rule, I would say. Even though it gets by alright, don't expect this to be a Pixel or a iPhone killer when it comes to the consistency of the results. That being said, you do have plenty of options here. Jumping into the ultra-wide angle lens, as well as using Google Lens to scan in barcodes and objects automatically, you can record video up to 4K 30 FPS, and under more, there are high pixel, which allows you to capture the full 48 megapixel image versus typically it will bin itself down to 12 megapixels to save on space. There's also the macro mode for close-up shots, slow motion as well, and then you can also find a night mode that will slightly increase the exposure time, creating bokeh effects, as well as a pro mode which allows you to tweak things like ISO, white balance, as well as focus more manually. So at the very least, it is quite simple and easy to use, and the results themselves are not shabby. This is the primary lens, which does a pretty good job when it comes to overall level of detail, including some of the texture of the clouds, thanks to HDR, still doing alright. This is the ultra-wide angle lens, which surprisingly doesn't distort too much at the edges either, so lens correction is actually done a little bit better than expected, although detail and resolution will be a little bit lower here, though you are able to capture more without having to step as far back. Colors and details are all quite reasonable, and I would say for the most part, as a super budget phone these days, again around 50 bucks, you can't really complain too much. In fact, it's already doing a little bit better than expected. That being being said, again, if you are comparing it with the actual Pixel 5 or even the aforementioned Nokia 8.3, then this isn't going to be quite as impressive. Nokia's devices have a more powerful kind of Zeiss optics and some pro mode for video capture in a 21:9 aspect ratio, very similar to on some Sony Xperia Mark I phones. So if you do care more about, again, having really high-end video recording capabilities, the 8.3 might be a better option, although it's also going to be typically about 20 to 30 bucks more expensive, although again, TCL's device here is a little bit more compact and has the advantage of those pretty special display modes, especially for reading, that might make it compelling for other types of users. Now, jumping into a quick kind of web browsing test here as well, we can tell that, again, pages for the most part do load up quite quickly, all thanks to the 765G, which I have to say is holding up a lot better than I really expected. We can also try typing something in, and the haptic vibration motor underneath is also feeling quite tight and precise for a mid-range phone as well. Really no issues here when it comes to browsing around even more complex sites like The Verge, and overall, again, this is handling itself quite well. No real thermal throttling issues either, so the phone still remains quite cool as you are pressing it a little bit harder. The 6 gigabytes of RAM is able to comfortably open up around 10 tabs or so in the Chrome browser, and I was still able to jump back and forth between things that are being held open in the memory as well. And now jumping into a quick demo of video playback and what the speakers sound like next. Some takeaways would be that, unfortunately, the TCL 10 5G has only a single speaker at the bottom of the phone. Benefits, though, is it doesn't really distort even at higher volume levels and has a little bit more depth than I was expecting when it comes to bass. That being said, you don't get as much of a stereo effect, which is as satisfying as phones that have a stereo speaker there. So that is one thing to keep in mind, but you do have, again, a standard headphone jack in addition to using wireless headphones via Bluetooth. The display here, again, is actually quite good for this price range. Again, it's not OLED, but it's nearly there when it comes to contrast using the conversion tech that TCL has built on in, and still seems quite immersive as you're consuming content, especially with, again, the fairly good 1080p resolution here as well. And again, video clips do load up quite quickly due to the strong antenna reception quality. I was getting almost full bars when it came to dual band Wi-Fi, as well as if you're using 5G cellular as well. So you don't have to wait too long for videos to kind of load up, even as you're doing some multitasking, picture-in-picture, it all still works pretty decently. Now, when it comes to gaming performance, surprisingly, again, the 765G is still quite capable when it comes to most titles. Even heavier ones, including Genshin, PUBG, and Asphalt series, can still be installed and run on lower graphic settings, that is. So even though it's not really a gamer phone per se, which you would typically want to look for more powerful GPU performance in the Snapdragon 800 8th Gen series, but for just casual gaming as well as for any social media apps, there's really nothing that the chip here can't handle. So that is more or less it as far as our hands-on review of the TCL 10 5G UW. Again, it's a pretty quirky phone just because TCL's presence in the smartphone space perhaps isn't felt in the same way as more established brands and players. But as a smartphone enthusiast, I was quite curious to see what they could bring to the table. They have really emphasized areas including the display tech, especially that reading mode is surprisingly good. At the same time, the display is still quite vibrant in the regular mode if you're watching back videos with that HDR10 certification, and that slightly curved 2.5D glass as well, which makes swipes and interactions on the screen actually feel quite nice and responsive, including the design as well, which looks quite distinctive, even though it is a little bit on the slippery slide and can attract fingerprints a bit easily. But again, the camera bar at the very least is completely flat, so if you lie the phone down, at least it doesn't really wobble on a surface either. So you can check out more details about this phone as well as other TCL devices if interested in the links down below. A pretty interesting venture there for this brand. You can learn more details, but for now that's been our video. Thanks for watching here at OS Reviews. That's been a closer look at the TCL 10 5G